It started on a sunny afternoon in a busy city square when a shocking confrontation between a black woman and several uniformed police officers turned into something that would make headlines across the nation and spark heated conversations online about race, authority, and the line between protest and criminal behavior. The woman, armed not with fists or weapons but with a spray can filled with a burning chemical solution, unleashed chaos on the police who were trying to control a tense situation. And in that one single moment her actions sealed her fate and set her on a path that would lead her from the center of attention to the cold reality of facing the consequences of her choices. And before you judge too quickly, you need to hear every detail of how it happened, because this is not just a story about a clash in the street. It is a story about pride, anger, accountability, and the heavy price one pays when emotions boil over into lawlessness. So stay with me, because the truth of what happened is far more gripping than you can imagine, and the ending will leave you stunned. The day began with the police department already on edge, because for weeks tensions had been rising between officers and members of the community. A protest had been planned and the officers were deployed to keep peace, but what no one knew was that one woman would turn the protest into a personal stage for her rage. She was described by neighbors as outspoken, proud, and often confrontational, someone who never backed down when challenged, and that fiery nature is what collided head-on with the authority of law enforcement on that fateful afternoon. She arrived at the square wearing a red jacket, her hair tied back and her expression hard as stone. Eyewitnesses say she carried a small bag with her tightly zipped, and no one suspected what was inside until the moment came when voices clashed with commands and shouts turned into shoves. That bag would become the symbol of her downfall. But let me warn you, things didn't unravel all at once. They built slowly, like a fire that starts as smoke until suddenly it bursts into flames. Police officers had formed a line in the square, some holding shields, others scanning the crowd with wary eyes. The woman pushed closer, shouting insults at the officers, daring them to arrest her, calling them names that cut deep, words designed to provoke. And at first the officers tried to ignore her, tried to keep calm, but you could see on their faces that the verbal attacks were stinging. One officer in particular, a tall man with years of experience, clenched his jaw but stayed firm in formation. Then it happened. She reached into her bag and in one swift motion pulled out a silver can and pressed the nozzle, sending a stream of burning liquid into the air. The spray hit two officers in the face. They recoiled, stumbling back, their eyes burning, their skin stinging. The crowd gasped, some cheered, others screamed in fear, and in that split second the woman grinned as if she had finally gotten the attention she wanted. But what she didn't realize was that cameras were rolling from every angle and her victory would be short-lived, because when you attack officers in broad daylight, the law always comes down heavy. But before the officers could recover, she charged forward, shouting that she was tired of being silenced, tired of being oppressed, her voice echoing through the square like a battle cry. This is where things spiraled, and if you think you know how the story ends, you don't, because what followed was a chain of events that shocked not just the police but the entire city. Yet right here I must leave you with a question: what happens when defiance crosses the line into a felony, and how far can anger carry someone before the system shuts them down? Hold that thought, because the twist you're about to hear will keep you glued until the very end. Police backup rushed and the woman was still shouting, holding the can like a trophy, while officers struggled to get their bearings. One officer pulled out handcuffs, another shouted for her to drop the can, but instead of surrendering she raised it again, threatening to spray anyone who came near. That's when the situation became a standoff. Civilians pulled out phones, recording every angle. Live stream spread online within minutes, and the woman seemed to revel in the attention, smirking at the cameras as if she was a hero standing up to the system. But heroes don't leave. Two officers screaming in pain, clawing at their faces, begging for relief from burning chemicals. And this is where her narrative began to unravel, because even those who cheered her act started to fall silent when they saw the real damage. Medics rushed in trying to treat the injured while police tightened their circle around her. She shouted that she wasn't afraid of prison, that they couldn't silence her. But the truth is, no matter how loud she yelled, reality was closing in. The law was tightening its grip, and she was seconds away from losing control of everything she thought she stood for. She tried to run, weaving through the crowd, but the square was filled with officers and there was nowhere to escape. An officer lunged, catching her arm. The spray can clattered to the ground, rolling across the pavement, and the crowd erupted in noise, some chanting against the police, others begging her to stop resisting. Now here's the part that will make you sit on the edge of your seat, because what happened next wasn't a clean arrest, it wasn't simple compliance, it turned into a violent struggle that showed just how far she was willing to go to fight authority. And the way it ended left scars on both sides, scars that would be replayed on the news for weeks, leaving viewers debating whether justice had been served or whether things had gone too far. The officers wrestled her to the ground, but she kicked and clawed, screaming that they were abusing her. Cameras caught every second. One officer tried to restrain her hands, but she twisted, biting his arm and drawing blood. He shouted in pain as another officer pulled her legs, trying to pin her down. The spray from earlier still hung faintly in the air, burning nostrils and making eyes water. The chaos was overwhelming, and yet she kept screaming, shouting her defiance, refusing to surrender until finally handcuffs clicked around her wrists and the fight was over, or so it seemed. But if you think that was the end, you're wrong, because what came after the arrest was even more dramatic. By now every major news station had grabbed the footage, the image of a woman in red being dragged away by police officers, her face twisted in rage, her words echoing about oppression and defiance spread like wildfire across social media. Supporters rallied, saying she was standing against a corrupt system. Critics slammed her as a criminal who attacked officers for attention, and as the debate grew, so did the pressure on city officials. The district attorney, the police chief, even the mayor were forced to address the situation, and each word they spoke only fueled the fire, further dividing the city into those who saw her as a symbol and those who saw her as a criminal. But let me pause here, because you need to ask yourself this: if you were in her shoes, would you have sprayed those officers? If you were filled with anger and convinced you were being silenced, would you risk it all for a moment of defiance? Think about it carefully, because the consequences she faced were not light, they were heavy and life-changing, and the price she paid serves as a lesson that still echoes today, and you'll see exactly what I mean as the story unfolds. The booking photo released later that night showed her face still filled with defiance. She glared into the camera, refusing to look broken, but behind that image was the reality of charges stacked high: assault on a police officer, use of a chemical weapon, resisting arrest, disturbing the peace, each one carrying years of possible prison time. And suddenly the pride she carried so boldly in the square seemed small compared to the weight of the legal hammer that was about to fall. And this is where her story takes a darker turn, because while she sat in a cell thinking she had made her point, the system was already moving faster than she realized, and her trial would become one of the most watched cases in the state. And here's where I must leave you hanging again, because what came out in court shocked everyone. It wasn't just about the spray, it wasn't just about the clash, it turned into a full-blown revelation of her past, her motives, and her hidden struggles, things no one expected to come to light, things that changed how people saw her forever. The courtroom was packed the day her trial began. Reporters lined the halls, cameras flashed every time the heavy doors swung open, and inside the tension was so thick you could feel it in the air. The woman walked in, shackled at the wrists, wearing an orange jumpsuit, but her chin was raised, her eyes hard as stone. She didn't look like someone who was about to beg for mercy, she looked like someone ready to fight the system again, this time with words instead of sprays. But the law is not swayed by bravado, it is swayed by evidence, and the prosecution had plenty of it: video footage from multiple angles, testimony from injured officers, medical reports that described the burns caused by her chemical spray, and the live streams that went viral showing her smirking as she raised the can against uniformed men sworn to protect the city. The prosecutor began by painting her as reckless, dangerous, and defiant, someone who believed she was above the law, and as the jury listened, her supporters in the gallery whispered words of encouragement, convinced she was a martyr. But then the defense rose and turned the entire courtroom upside down. Her lawyer argued that she was not a criminal, but a woman pushed beyond her limits by years of mistreatment, harassment, and neglect from the very system that now wanted to bury her. They said she carried pain from past encounters with police that left her scarred. They revealed moments from her life where she claimed officers had humiliated her, ignored her pleas, and treated her as less than human. And suddenly the room was no longer looking at a reckless attacker, but at a human being shaped by trauma and rage. But here's the twist: the prosecution wasn't finished. They dug deeper into her past, uncovering incidents she never wanted the world to hear about. Records showed she had been arrested before, not once but multiple times, for confrontations with authority, assaulting store clerks, shouting threats at neighbors, resisting small-town officers during traffic stops. The prosecutor's voice rang loud and clear, telling the jury this wasn't a one-time mistake, this was a pattern, a dangerous habit that escalated until it finally exploded in the city square, with officers writhing in pain from her spray. The crowd in the courtroom gasped, supporters shook their heads, claiming the system was smearing her, but the damage was done. Her image of being a victim had cracked wide open, and now the jury had to decide whether she was a fighter against injustice or simply a repeat offender who had finally gone too far. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, some holding signs saying "Free her," others demanding justice for the injured officers. Police kept a heavy presence, worried that clashes might erupt again, and in many ways the trial became bigger than her. It became a symbol of the never-ending tension between communities and law enforcement. But at the center of all that noise was one woman whose fate hung in the balance, and as days of testimony rolled by, the weight of the consequences pressed harder each second. Then came the moment that no one expected. The prosecution revealed a surprise witness. One of the officers who had been sprayed stood in the witness box, his eyes still showing faint scars from the burns, his voice shaking as he described the pain, the blinding agony, the fear that his eyesight might be permanently damaged. He told the jury about the panic as he felt the chemicals searing his face, about the helplessness when he stumbled blinded. In uniform, surrounded by chaos, his words painted a vivid picture that no video clip could fully capture, and as he spoke the courtroom fell silent. Even her supporters lowered their heads, because this was no longer about politics or slogans. This was about raw human suffering caused by a single decision to pull that nozzle. The defense tried to shake his testimony, but the officer's sincerity was unshakable. He admitted that police weren't perfect, that tensions were high, that mistakes had been made in the city's past, but he insisted nothing justified being attacked with chemicals for simply doing his duty. The jury sat stone-faced, absorbing every word, and in that moment the scales of justice seemed to tip heavier against her. Yet just when it seemed the case was sealed, her lawyer pulled a move that left everyone gasping. They called her to the stand, and instead of cold defiance, she broke down in tears. For the first time since her arrest, she dropped the wall of rage and let the world see her humanity. She spoke of growing up in poverty, of watching friends taken away by police, of feeling invisible and unheard. She said the spray can was not meant as a weapon, but as a desperate cry for attention, a scream for respect and recognition. She admitted she went too far, but insisted it was never her plan to cause permanent harm. Her words cracked through the silence, and for a brief moment even the jury softened, seeing not just an aggressor but a broken woman lashing out at a world that she felt had never cared about her. But here is where I leave you hanging again, because the jury had to decide, was she a victim who snapped under pressure, or was she a dangerous agitator who put lives at risk? And the verdict they delivered would shake the city and shock everyone watching. The judge's gavel pounded, calling for order as the jury filed back into the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. Tension coiled through the room like a wire stretched to its limit. Her lawyer squeezed her hand while the prosecutor stared straight ahead. The foreman stood unfolding a piece of paper. The silence was so heavy you could hear people breathing, and then the words rang out: guilty on multiple counts, guilty of assault, guilty of using a chemical agent against law enforcement, guilty of resisting arrest. The woman's eyes closed for a second, but then opened again, hard with that same defiance, though you could see in her trembling hands that reality had finally hit her. The gallery erupted. Supporters shouted no justice, critics clapped, officers sat with relief. But the drama wasn't over, because the judge still had to deliver the sentence, and what he said would determine whether her life ended in years behind bars or whether she had a chance at redemption. The sentencing hearing drew even bigger crowds. The prosecution asked for the maximum penalty, saying her actions endangered not just officers but the public. Her defense begged for leniency, painting her as troubled but redeemable. The woman herself spoke one last time, her voice softer than before. She said she regretted the pain she caused, but she would never regret standing up for what she believed in. She asked the judge not for freedom, but for understanding. But the law is not built on sentiment. It is built on accountability, and the judge's words came like thunder. He sentenced her to 10 years in prison with no chance of parole for the first 5, and the gasp that rippled through the room was deafening. Supporters screamed as officers moved to escort her away. She stumbled slightly, her face pale but still holding her head high. She shouted to the cameras as they dragged her out that her fight wasn't over, that history would remember her not as a criminal but as a symbol. But inside the system she was no longer a symbol, she was an inmate, and the cold steel bars would remind her every day that actions have consequences. But here's where things take another shocking twist, because prison didn't break her the way people expected. Instead it turned into a stage for a new chapter of her story, and the way she adapted behind bars became a tale so surprising that even her harshest critics couldn't ignore it. Stay with me, because what happened inside those walls will keep you hooked until the very end. Prison was supposed to be the end of her story, but for the woman in the red jacket turned inmate number 4571, it became the beginning of something no one expected. The first days were brutal. Cold walls slammed shut behind her, guards barked orders, inmates sized her up, some sneered, others whispered her name as if they already knew her from the viral videos that spread across the nation. She walked into the yard with eyes on her from every direction. Some saw her as a fighter who stood against authority, others saw her as reckless and dangerous. The line between respect and resentment was razor thin, and one wrong move could have ended her survival on the spot. At night she lay on a hard cot, replaying the moment she pressed the spray can, the screams of the officers, the cameras, the handcuffs, and she wondered, was it worth it? Her pride said yes, her fear said no, and between those voices she found herself caught in a storm. The guards didn't treat her kindly. They remembered the footage of injured officers, many of them friends, colleagues, brothers in uniform. To them she wasn't just another inmate, she was the enemy, and that made her time harder. Meals withheld, punishments doubled, eyes watching for her to slip up, and the weight of the sentence pressed down heavier each day. But she refused to break, at least not outwardly. She stood tall in the yard, stared back at the whispers, and began to form alliances with women who admired her boldness. Some of them had their own histories with police, stories of being roughed up or ignored by the justice system. They rallied around her, and soon she wasn't alone. She had a circle, a makeshift family inside the walls, and this gave her power. She began speaking in the yard, telling stories of the day she sprayed officers, talking about defiance, about courage, about never bowing to authority. And other inmates listened, some nodded, others clapped, and in that yard her voice grew louder again. But power in prison comes with danger. Rival groups watched her rise and didn't like it. One night in the showers she was cornered. 3 women stepped forward, one with a sharpened toothbrush. The whispers of revenge hung heavy in the steam. Her heart raced, but she refused to flinch. She stood face to face with the threat until guards stormed in, breaking it up, dragging the attackers away. She was safe for now, but the message was clear. In prison, attention makes you a target, and survival requires more than bold words. It requires cunning. The months turned into a year, and the woman who once smirked at cameras began to change. The walls stripped her bravado layer by layer. She saw women break down in tears, missing their children, missing their freedom. She saw fights end in blood. She saw the despair of endless days blending together, and she realized that outside the world had moved on. Protests faded, the news cycle shifted. Her name wasn't on every lip anymore, and the silence from beyond the bars hit harder than any sentence, because the fame she thought she had claimed was gone, forgotten by a society that had already moved to the next headline. That reality forced her to reflect. She started attending programs in the prison, anger management sessions, group therapy classes. She mocked them at first, but slowly something inside her shifted. She began to speak less about defiance and more about pain, about loss, about choices. She started writing letters, not to supporters, but to the very officers she had sprayed, apologizing for the harm she caused. Some letters went unanswered, others came back with words she never expected, words of forgiveness. From one officer who wrote that he still bore scars but chose not to let hatred define him. Reading that letter shook her more than the sentence ever had, because for the first time she felt the weight of what she had truly done. Inside prison she began working in the library, surrounded by books she had never cared for before. She discovered stories of other people who had fought battles with the system, some who lost, some who changed. She began to write her own story, filling notebooks with reflections not of rage but of remorse and hope. She handed them to other inmates who read them and found strength, and suddenly her role shifted. She was no longer the woman who sprayed cops, she was the inmate who listened, the one who encouraged others to think before acting, the one who spoke about consequences not as a theory but as lived truth. But even as she found this new path, the danger of prison never vanished. One night alarms blared, fights erupted in the yard, and chaos swept through the blocks. She was caught in the middle, pushed, shoved, nearly trampled as guards unleashed tear gas and locked down the facility. In the smoke and confusion she thought for a moment she would die right there, but when the dust settled she realized survival had given her one more chance, and she vowed never to waste it again. Years passed, and the defiant fire that once fueled her transformed into something else: resilience, discipline, and a strange kind of wisdom. She became a mentor to younger inmates, telling them not to repeat her mistakes. She warned them that one moment of rage could destroy a life, and those who listened began to see her not as a fighter but as a teacher. Prison officials noticed her changes too. Reports showed improvement, a decrease in disciplinary write-ups, participation in rehabilitation programs. And when the 5-year mark arrived, whispers of parole began to circulate. The parole board hearing was her second trial, but this time there were no cameras, no crowds, no shouting, just a small room with stern faces asking hard questions. She spoke quietly about her journey, her regrets, the harm she caused, and the lessons she learned. She did not deny her guilt, she owned it, and for the first time her words carried weight, not from defiance but from humility. The board deliberated in silence, and after what felt like a lifetime they returned with a decision: parole granted. When she walked out of those gates 5 years later, the sun hit her face differently than it had on that day in the square. She no longer wore the red jacket, no longer carried a spray can, no longer craved the roar of a crowd. She carried only the weight of lessons carved into her soul. She was free, but freedom came with shadows society hadn't forgotten entirely. Some still called her a criminal, some still called her a symbol. She tried to live quietly, taking small jobs, working in shelters, speaking to youth about anger and choices, and slowly a different reputation formed, not the viral woman of rage but the reformed woman who lived through the consequences and came out changed. Yet even now her story remains a warning. Her name resurfaces whenever protests flare, her image shown as an example of how far is too far, her words quoted in classrooms where teachers warned students about impulse and control. She became a living reminder that actions, no matter how small or quick, can define years of your life. And the cliffhanger that remains for you watching right now is this: what would you have done in her place? Would you have sprayed those officers knowing the price would be years behind bars? Would you have held your anger in or unleashed it? And if you did unleash it, would you be able to survive the storm that followed? Her story proves one thing beyond all doubt: no matter who you are, no matter how strong you think your defiance is, the law will always deliver consequences and the world will always remember your choices, but whether those choices define you forever or whether you rise from them with a new purpose is up to you. She faced her consequences and lived to tell the tale, but the question is, if tomorrow you are tested, will you make the choice that keeps you free, or the one that locks the door behind you forever? So if you've stayed with me until now, let her journey be more than just entertainment. Let it be a lesson, a mirror, a call to think twice before rage controls your hand. And remember, this story doesn't end with her, because tomorrow it could begin with you. Subscribe, like, and share, because the next story I bring you will grip you even harder and you don't want to miss it.